You're listening to Brainwork Framework, a business and marketing podcast, brought to you by focus-biz.com.
Business owners and entrepreneurs, are you trying to go from your zone of caution to your zone of courageous? With us today is a CEO and Chief Storyteller of Melissa Boggs Speaking and Consulting. Melissa Boggs, thanks so much for joining us. How are you today?
Hi, Chris. Good morning. I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks so much for joining us. We wanted to have you on to share more about your business experience and your entrepreneurial journey. What were you doing before, and how did that bring you into what you're doing today?
Awesome. So I always say I grew up on the people side of tech. So for those who are familiar with agile software development, it's a way of working inside of software, and now it's kind of made its way beyond that. That is a bit non-traditional, different than the PMP style product management. And that's the type of work that I did for, I don't know, probably 15 years, helping teams work better together, helping them to work in an incremental and iterative way so that they can get feedback and iterate on what they're learning from their customers. And also just generally like helping people bring their whole selves to work and be able to do that in a healthy way, help us communicate better. A lot of the quote unquote soft skills, which by the way are the much harder skills, are the types of things that I helped people with during the span of my career. Ultimately, that led to organizational design, organizational development, and leadership coaching. And I actually specialize in a coaching around non-hierarchical organizational structures. So for listeners who might be familiar with things like holacracy or sociocracy, or just kind of overall democratizing the workplace, that is where I help leaders specifically in a one-on-one capacity. And that led into my current work because as I was working with these leaders who desperately wanted to decentralize their authority, allow the organization to grow, and for people who are the closest to the work to make their own decisions, there's a lot of fear in that. And understandably, they're still the CEO, they're still responsible for the whole of the organization, for the success of the organization. And I just realized how much I was working with a sense of fear for really good reason, right? I am also a keynote speaker. One of the primary things that I do is speak for crowds that are looking for moving out of that place of how do I get from being cautious to being courageous with this thing, whether it's an idea, a business idea, maybe it's just a process that you see at work, but you're afraid to bring it up because it's been around forever. How do you get to a place of courage to say, hey, I think this needs to change?
Absolutely. That's really cool. I love that background where you were taking the human side and a technology approach and kind of bringing those together. And then today, how you're bringing that into the next generation of leaders and these businesses that are non-traditional. They just kind of have their own hierarchy structure. They have these CEOs and owners who are a bit too close to the work and they feel like they need the approval always. But then it's more about empowering the team and allowing them to take responsibility, controls. That way you can step back from that. Have you noticed a trend within certain types of businesses or industries or under a certain employee count is when they're really experiencing a lot of these symptoms?
In my experience, a lot of the leaders have been in relatively smaller companies, the ones that are willing to say, hey, I don't have to make every decision. I'm not willing to be a bottleneck. I'm actually like, I want to make an effort to make sure I delegate and that the people closest to the work are making the decision. So it does tend to be in smaller companies. Now, I will say, not in my own experience, but just generally speaking, the biggest one to my knowledge is Zappos, which has a couple thousand employees. They famously adopted holacracy back in 2015, did it for a couple of years, and then went even further, meaning they went beyond just, hey, we don't have any managers. We all work they had little businesses that were sprouting up throughout the entire company. It was the most entrepreneurial thing you've probably ever seen. Now, for those familiar with Zappos, the leader of Zappos was Tony Hsieh, and he sadly passed away a couple of years ago. So I'm not sure what the status of that is now, but they did prove that it is possible in a larger company to work without a typical traditional management structure.
That is super cool. And it's honestly refreshing to hear that we can do things a little bit differently and get different results. They may be good or bad, but that's the beauty of experimentation here. A lot of CEOs, entrepreneurs, we're all taking, short-term risk for hopefully a long-term gain, but it doesn't always equal into that. And it's tough letting go of the reins because again, our business is kind of like our baby. How do we make that mindset shift into I'm the only one who can take care of this or do it as good as me into I need to trust and empower my team to grow further.
So I'll dip a little bit into my framework here, just putting it out there. So in my keynote that I deliver on roller skates, and we can talk about that later, I walk people through a 4-step framework. And I propose that these 4 steps are the steps that we all go through in any situation where we are approaching something new or learning something new. We may go at it faster in some cases for different reasons, but we all go through these 4 steps. We always start out from a cautious state, and that is simply our brain protecting us. Our brain is wired to say, hey, this is new. We don't know how to do it. We don't know if it's safe, sort of the caveman, looking out for the saber-toothed tiger. So we all start from a cautious space. Then we move into a place of curiosity. And in that place of curiosity, we may not actually be taking action yet, but we are asking good questions. We are asking things like, what's the worst that could happen? What is the best that could happen? And in the keynote and just in my coaching, I ask leaders to get more creative with those questions. And what we're trying to do there is not just answer the questions, but also move our brain out of that protective state. If we can just move our brain to a state of, oh, well, maybe that's possible, then we've at least taken one step closer to whatever it is that we are interested in doing. Then we can only move into courage. And sometimes courage is a small thing like having a conversation with your boss, but small things sometimes take big courage, or sometimes it's huge, like filing for your LLC and launching a business that no one else maybe thinks can be successful. But we have to kind of move through those steps. And then the 4th step is kind of a bonus step because maybe this one is not always necessary, but often we are looking down the face of things like systemic change. So if we're in an organization and we want to propose that we do something completely non-traditional, completely never done before, never heard of before, then we actually have to have some level of audacity. And audacity means fearless and brave in the face of doubt and fear, all of those things. And so the final one in the talk is audacious. How do we get to a place of being audacious?
I love it. That's really cool to hear the framework behind it because, yeah, we are a bit cautious and then we get curious, like, okay, is this possible? So walking through that steps kind of help us understand our own behaviors and that it's completely normal to experience things like that. Now, you mentioned these roller skates. I want to hear more about those. Tell me about those.
I could talk about roller skates all day, so I hope you have 6 hours.
Hey, let's go.
Um, so I was a roller skater as a kid. I always tell people that I don't even remember learning how to skate because my mom was a skater and I probably had skates on when I was 2. Like, I don't even remember. I've always known how. I skated all the way through high school. And then you grow up and you get away from your childhood hobbies, things like that. And so I didn't skate for 20 years, save the occasional, my kids are going to a birthday party at a rink. I might put on some rental skates. But like everyone, during the pandemic, I needed something. I needed to get outside. I needed to move my body. And that was a safe way to exercise. I also hate the gym. And so it was a good excuse to not do that. And so I started skating again. It's now been almost 4 years since I donned a pair of skates once again. And I was pretty easily able to just jump back into skating in a circle, but I didn't just want that. So I started learning how to roller dance. If you can imagine somewhere between like hip hop dancing and like what you would see on ice skates when they do artistic dancing, it's somewhere in the middle of that. And as I was approaching each new move or spin or turn, I found myself telling myself the same things that I was telling my leaders. How do you get curious about this? This looks terrifying. You're 40 years old. You're going to break something, like how do you get curious about these things? And so that is when this talk was born. Like this one's like a talk that emerged. I've been a keynote speaker for several years. I always had to write them before, if that makes sense. Like I had to I'm going to sit down and write a talk about this. This was something that was born that became really clear to me as my personal and professional paths sort of converged. And so the premise of the talk is the 4-step framework that I shared with you, but it is the notion that we all see possibility every day. Every day we see, hey, I wonder if that's possible. But what do we do to move through those 4 steps in order to actually move through possibility and allow possibility to be the thing that gets us from one step to the next? So I built this talk around that 4-step framework, but essentially what I do is at each one of those steps, I have a 60 to 75-second choreography set. And so I will talk about being cautious, and then I will skate about being cautious. And it's very demonstrative of what I just talked about. And then I will talk about how do you move then from cautious to curious. And I have these little lessons, these little very actionable takeaways from the roller rink that make it really memorable for people. Things like taking up space and being willing to take a risk. And how do you reduce your risk when you're trying something new? All of those things are kind of sprinkled in between. So 4 different times during the talk, I skate for about a minute. It's always really fun music that people recognize, which makes the keynote memorable. And these are things that people take away and actually implement because there's these catchy phrases that help them remember these lessons that we learned together.
That is so cool. You put your own unique spin and flavor onto this presentation that married, the interest and the love for skating with business and everything. And to hear that is something you picked up just around the COVID time. I think many of us were impacted by COVID. Either we learned to roller skate, we started baking bread and then throwing it away, or we had some big impacts and shifts through COVID, both personally and within business. Were there other things you noticed either between your own business or other businesses that you've seen like a big shift in the way things operate, the demand or anything within their business?
Absolutely. I actually talk about this kind of the setup for going into talking about like why roller skates. My observation is that our response to COVID pandemic has been one of 2 things. You either collapsed inside of yourself. Like there are people who are far more introverted and dare I even say like agoraphobic, like not wanting to leave their house since COVID, or the other direction. You faced COVID in the face, you faced death or mortality or just being cooped up in your house for 2 years. And you were like, I have so much life to live. I have so much I want to do. And people just embrace what it is that they feel passionate about now because they see that they only have so much time to actually do things in life. And I see that in small ways. I see that in huge ways. And especially when I give this talk, because I have people come up to me afterwards and say, oh my gosh, yes. Since the pandemic, this conference is the first conference I've been to in 4 years because I haven't wanted to be around people. Or I have people saying, hey, you're absolutely right. And now I'm going to go do this huge thing that I've been thinking about for 4 years. And so it's not necessarily like a business strategy that's changed. It's how we perceive the world and how we perceive our place in it that I see has changed.
I love that perspective on it because our human behavior affects business as a whole. And like you said, there were wide gaps between, I'm either staying inside or I'm going outside, doesn't matter. And I myself, I experienced like 6 of those feelings back and forth all the way through. I was like, first, I'm going to makeshift my own mask. And then I'm like, no, I'm just going to go outside. It doesn't matter. I'm a little scared again. So we have these wild range of emotions here that definitely affected us going forward, both human to human, and then just business and how we kind of perceive the world, as you mentioned. You have such a great mind. I love the way that you kind of think. Do you have like a favorite book, podcast, or anything that was really influential in your journey that you would recommend to others?
Sure, a couple. First, just when it comes to the organizational design work that I do, there's a book called Reinventing Organizations. So if any of that piqued your curiosity, like, what do you mean companies with no managers? That book is phenomenal. And it talks about not just the extremes of not having managers, but sort of just different organizations at different levels and how they approach management, which is really cool. It's very easy to read. In terms of favorite podcasts, I am always and forever a Brene Brown fan. I love her work. I love what she stands for. Obviously, she talks about courage all the time and vulnerability, which is dovetailed nicely with what I do as well. So she has a couple of podcasts actually. So I would just say, go find Brene Brown.
That's so cool. And you run and host your own podcast as well. Tell me more about that.
I do. And it's been a little while since I put out my last episode. Season 3 has been pending for a minute, but it was quite a joy. I did a podcast called Wild Hearts at Work. I did 2 seasons, both about 18 episodes each. So there's still some really good content out there. And my intent was, as I was doing some of this pushing against the status quo work, I would constantly get told, that sounds nice in theory, but in the real world, dot, 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 dot. So I started the podcast with the intent of giving people something to point at. Here are some real life examples of people doing wild things at work that worked and that are no longer theory, but they are in the real world. And sometimes that was as simple as, like, I remember one guest in particular, we just talked about love at work. Like, it's okay to have love for people at work, but that sounds really subversive to some people and giving people something to point to. And ironically, it's come up 3 times this week. So I feel like the universe is like, hey, bring it back. So,
Time to bring the podcast back.
yeah, but I had a blast. It was truly like a labor of love because getting to hear people's stories, getting to elevate those stories and say, hey, look, like, it's not insane. It actually worked was super fun.
That is so cool. I've honestly been podcasting technically maybe about 7, 8 years, but there's always like different versions of it. Like, okay, here's 6 episodes on this one. Then we wait a couple of years and come back to it. And it kind of evolves and changes over time. But it's cool because you can create some fun content. You get to highlight who you are and what you do. But then you get to, like you said, lift other voices up. And again, just make fun content from it. For you as a business owner, what has been the most effective marketing strategies for you? Are you doing like traditional social media, Google business? Is it more like paid ads? Are you building relationships? What seems to be most effective for you?
So at the end of the day, the number one thing that works for me is relationships. I also do things like email outreach, particularly for my speaking. For this talk, I'm trying to get that video in front of anybody who will watch it. So I do that as well. I have a website that is SEO optimized, et cetera, et cetera. But the highest quality leads and the highest quality closings come from referrals, from showing up and providing value to people without asking for anything in return, and from patience, frankly. Sometimes those very long game, especially in things like speaking where it's service oriented and they don't need you every day. Right. So I have one example of a talk that I did 2 years ago virtually for a very low fee, like not my normal fee. It's 7 a.m. on a Saturday. But frankly, I just really liked the organizer. And I was like, you know what? Sure. Virtual is not super hard to do. I already have the content. I'll do it. The next year, this year, she called me back and brought me on site to do my keynote for 10 times the fee that she paid me last year. And I wasn't expecting that. That's not why I did it. I honestly did not expect her to come back and be like, okay, now we want you to come in person. We're going to pay you this much. And frankly, we're probably going to have you come every year. I just thought she was great. And I was like, yeah, I'll do it for you. So we all have to run a business. We all have to get to closing those leads and actually having business. But as much as you can, just be good to people and have a quality offer, have something that's worth selling. it will come around. When I first went into entrepreneurship, a friend of mine had been doing it for like 20 years or something. And he said to me when I was very anxious about leaving my corporate job, he said, Melissa, the river flows. What does that mean? We're talking about business. And he said, the river flows, meaning business is going to come and business is going to go. And you just have to keep being consistent and like let it flow around you. And if you do that, like it will all work out, which sounds very like woo woo, but he has not been wrong at all.
Business is scary. There's a lot of unknown, and we're taking these calculated risks, and we don't know if it's going to pay off. But that's the fun of the journey through it. And it is great to hear how effective relationship building has been for you. B2B, it's a longer sales cycle. People need to know you, trust you. And sometimes you need to strike that balance between when is it okay to discount my speaking fee, where it could provide enormous upside down the road. Again, that short term sacrifice for the long term gain. You're doing it right. You know what you're doing. You got it locked in and dialed in. I love to hear it. For those who are interested in learning more about your offer and getting connected with you, where can they find you online?
My website is very tricky. It's very difficult to find. It's a very hard name. It's just melissaboggs.com. But yes, find me at melissaboggs.com. My email address is melissa@melissaboggs.com. And I am also very findable and communicable on LinkedIn.
Wonderful. And we'll have the links available down in the description and show notes for all of our listeners. Now, Melissa, if there's one piece of advice that you could share with your younger self about business, marketing, anything that you've learned, what would that piece of advice be?
The number one thing that I would tell myself is that it is a long game. I had no expectation of a silver bullet necessarily, but we are so accustomed to instant gratification that I think I would have just told myself, like, you just keep doing the right things, get feedback, whether it's on the business side or on the content that you're providing, like, get feedback, continually evolve, and just stay in it. I think we can easily get discouraged too soon.
Absolutely. That is some great advice and something that we all need to keep in mind. Not just business owners, but everyday life change the way that we kind of perceive the world and expect things from others, giving more value than we receive. And eventually, karma, universe, whatever we call it, will come back to us and eventually, provide us dividends. Melissa, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time to share your tips and tricks. Any last words of wisdom that you would like to share with our audience?
I'll give you my tagline: let possibility move you. It's not enough just to see it, let it make you take action.
I love it. Melissa, thank you so much. Congratulations on all your past success, and I'm looking forward to your future success as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chris.